Welcome to our Voices from History Past program. We're thrilled to be gathering again this summer to learn about Hutchinson's history. We had so much fun last summer, so we brought it back again this summer. Today's program is the first in a series of summer programs provided by Historic Hutchinson. We are so grateful for Historic Hutchinson and all the great things this group does for our community. I can't tell you enough about them, but that's what Jim's here for, so that's good. I'd like to also extend our sincere thanks to HCDN for filming these programs. I'm going to name out Val again because I did this last time, and then she will either edit me or not. We'll see. Either way, it's a win-win for me. Today we're thrilled to welcome historian Jim Fahey to our library. I said this last year, he really does not need an introduction. He is one of the most knowledgeable people in Hutchinson that I know, and I'm honored to know him. Jim will be talking today about the visionaries, Hutchinson's founders. So please give a warm welcome to Jim Fahey. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. There's a big difference between a historian and a storyteller. The storyteller is really good at making stuff up. So, it's great to see you here. Thanks for coming and joining us. This is an exciting part of what Historic Hutchinson is doing, and we're getting a lot better at this. And one of the reasons is because we're almost 25 years old now. We've spent the first 25 years on brick and mortar projects, but if you look at our mission statement, it talks about to preserve and to protect the living and structural history and spirit of the Hutchinson area, and to showcase those assets now and in the future. And we were pretty close into what the task at hand were when we learned that we needed to become our own 501c3 and do a lot of fundraising. Because there was so much brick and mortar stuff to do. And we're getting to the point now, which there still is, but we're getting to the point now where it's more fun to tell the story. And we're able to talk about the living history, because the history of Hutchinson is so unique. And just two brick and mortar updates for you. Since we were here last, the clock showed back up on Main Street. That was a $30,000 restoration project. By the time we purchased the clock, gave it to the city of Hutchinson, and then paid for the restoration. So it's a modern atomic-driven clock now, so nobody has to wind it or change for the time. It's all driven by satellite, which is amazing, that technology being mixed with that old clock. But it looks good, and we're really glad and grateful to all the support that we had from the community to get that back up. And then the next, if you haven't been lately, and it can be hard to get to right now, if you drive by the Harrington Merrill house, the property, there's two things going on right now. And that is the barn, which was the old group home, which Historic Hutchinson moved back to the property, is in the mid stages of its rehabilitation back into a barn. Two new sides have new historically correct siding on that we were able to fabricate with a sawmill out of Big Lake, Minnesota, and we're excited about that. So if you can join us on Father's Day after the parade for our ice cream social, we kind of look at the progress of that. And then also the sidewalk is ripped up, that original sidewalk that almost got ripped up 35 or 40 years ago, and the neighborhood stopped it because it's made out of original Madison brick. Well, through this Washington Avenue rehab, the new city engineer, who's a big advocate of Historic Hutchinson, put in the project to take that sidewalk out, level it, and then reinstall those bricks so they're nice and level, so they'll last another 150 years. So that's what's going on there. You see that sidewalk ripped up. But the task at hand today is just to talk a little bit about the sketches of history of Hutchinson. And this is a document that I found, so I started to do research. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about W.W. Pendergast, even though he wasn't part of the original party. He's the reason that they came. And I started doing research, and I found this document. And it talks about the vision and the dream and the founders. And he was an interesting character, and he was also very learned. So he founded the first school, Pendergast Academy, which doubled as a tavern on Main Street in about 1858 or 9. And but it got burnt down. But he went on to found and be the first successful director of the agricultural school at the University of Minnesota. And his descendants are still around here. And in 2021, we lost one of our important members, who was Butch Pendergast, who was a descendant of W.W. Pendergast. And he wrote a book, and I started reading that, and I thought, oh man, I gotta quit that, because there's so much great information out there. There's great books. The Big Wood Meets the Prairie by Brian Haynes from the Historical Society, and the Hutchinson, Minnesota History book by Julie Jensen, and of course, Butch Pendergast. So I did find this document in the Library of Congress, and it's like 28 pages long. And I started reading it, and it dawned on me that Mr. Wirt was a storyteller. So he's also a historian, and he soaked all these things in, but then he was a storyteller. And I thought, well, why would I want to rewrite this story? I think I should just use it. So we're going to end today by me reading you the story, and I have a confession. These 24 pages are going to cover the next 3 years for me here, because it's such a fascinating story, and he does such a wonderful job of telling it. But we wanted to talk about the founders, because we talk about the Hutchinson brothers, and we talk about Harrington. We will talk about them today. But there were other founders as well. So we're just going to go through some things, and then we'll read William Wirt Pendergast's report at the monthly meeting of the Executive Council on February 11th, 1901. We found this at the Library of Congress. Katie's going to do some research for me to see what really this document is. If it is just a story that was presented to the Library of Congress, or if it was presented to another forum in the form of a meeting program that was eventually given to the Library of Congress. We don't know that. But we're going to find that out. We'll tell you next year. All right? Okay. William Wirt Pendergast. He's a fascinating guy. And he lived from 1833 to 1903. And he is going to tell us in his own words his story about how he came to be a part of this. Interestingly enough, he was not part of the original party, like many of us, including me, thought he was. Of course, the Hutchinson brothers were. And he talks about them, how he met, and interesting the things that you find out. Asa is the only one buried in Hutchinson. They didn't go on to their original plans. They founded a town in Kansas, and they had close relationships, I believe, to another one in Arkansas. But I believe Judson and John actually ended up going back to the New Hampshire, Massachusetts area, and that's where they passed away. Fascinating story about all the things that are relevant today. Mental health, how Judson struggled with that, and eventually could not stand the test of time and took his own life at the age of 49 because of his mental health issues and, of course, no help and support at that time. So it's a fascinating time. And then we're going to talk about some more obscure people that we seldom hear of, like Roswell H. Pendergast, who was a first cousin of William Pendergast. And he lived from 1932 to 1913, and he lived in Hutchinson for the first 3 years. And he married Helen Parker of Newmarket, Rockingham, New Hampshire in 1858, after he moved away from her. And then he moved to Duluth. He had 13 children, and he died in Minnesota at the age of 81, we presume, in Duluth. Right? He was part of the group. So was Mr. E.E. Johnson. And here's just an excerpt. On August 2nd, 1856, Judson John and Asa Hutchinson appointed E.E. Johnson as their sole agent to conduct all business related to the setting up and running of the steam sawmill. Johnson was paid $50 a month, and many of the early houses and the first school were built from timber sawed at that. So a lot of these guys were stakeholders. They were looking for jobs. They were looking for investments, and Mr. Johnson found his way. And then let's see. He was born in 1830, and his death was at the age of 53 in Washington. So we go back. Oh, there it is. Louis Idings Harrington. And it's interesting how they ran across each other. He ended up probably being one of the most important of the settlers, even more important than the Hutchinson brothers. His story is fascinating. He was learned. He cared deeply about all the things that he did, and he never left. He came here, spent his whole life here. His fingerprints were all over early Hutchinson and continuing on today. And we'll talk a little bit about him. Louis Harrington. This is in the book, a different book, but he was educated at Armstrong, and the first course of schooling. College was at Cleveland with a major in civil engineering at the age of 20. And he worked at the railroad for 2 years, and then he found his way to Minnesota to visit his brother, William. And his brother was living in Lake Minnetonka at the time. And he served as a surveyor for the Hutchinson brothers, but also for the federal government. And he, with the founders of the town in 1855, he served as the village postmaster, surveyor, hotel keeper, and he was just the pioneer of the town. Into mid-late 1850s, he surveyed and developed all of the roads that led to Hutchinson, as well as all of the existing roads that we have today. So this was his first thing with the Hutchinson brothers, and they hired him to plat out the town. Gave him $380 to do it, and it was a fascinating turn of events. We're not going to talk too much about that today. We talk about that a lot of other things, but we've got a lot of things to cover, but we might come back to this. We'll pass this around later so people can look at it. So he was really a mover and a shaker, and of course the builder of the Harrington Merrill House, okay, which is our claim to fame and our signature property. Okay, Colonel John H. Stevens. I had no idea. Now this guy's a big deal.
Yes.
He is a big deal. He was the first person commissioned and allowed to actually get this stuff going around here, and he was commissioned by the Army to do that. So not only was he part of the group that came to Hutchinson, he was also part of the group that first came to McLeod County. Okay, so he was kind of. If you got the nod from this guy, you could pretty much get it done if he was on your bandwagon. V.E. Messer, and he was born in 1880, and he died in 1926 at the age of 46. Died in Alabama. V.E. Messer. Just think about how these people were traveling around in the 1800s. He was a musician. He was a soulmate of the Hutchinsons. And there's an excerpt that we're going to read to you later, but it talks about how they had that first meeting, and they put all these plans together for their town, and they looked at each other and said, "This is good." And he was made something important in the town that we'll talk to, and he was elected the secretary of the town in the founding meeting. And to celebrate, he grabs his fiddle, and they all sing the Star Spangled Banner together. So interesting. It was that the arts, from the very first time, were heavily invested in Hutchinson. The Hutchinsons weren't very good business people. I'm not sure about Mr. Messer. Mr. Harrington and Mr. Wirt certainly were. John H. Chubb, he was a young bachelor from Whitehall, New York. And we found him. He was born in 1832 and he died in 1895. And died back in New York. Right? Henry Chambers, lots of question marks. He was an unnaturalized Canadian. I think he was a grunt. I think that they brought him along to do some of the heavy lifting that comes out in the part of the story. Chambers going ahead and breaking the ice with his feet as the water was 3 feet deep. And Glencoe, still 5 miles away, he unwillingly admitted that he got but little fun out of this operation. So something tells me he was on the bottom of the protocol. He doesn't show up anywhere else. And he probably, after they found Hutchinson, decided to get the hell out of it. Lucius M. Parker, 1823 to 1893. He came with the party, but he ended up back in Minneapolis. Okay, and we're going to read a little bit more about him. That's what that excerpt is. John Caliph, 1841 to 1912. He is the biggest mystery to us, and this is the only John Caliph that I could find. And I'm going to continue to look, because in 1841, he was born to John Church Caliph and his wife Eliza Bowman Haskell. And he lost 3 older brothers, and he attended the United States Military Academy and he graduated 22nd in his class. And then he went on to be a career artillery officer. He was in the Civil War, and he died in St. Louis, Missouri. And he's buried at West Point. But the interesting part about it, when you think about the time, when we're doing the math, he was 14 years old when he signed on to this. If this was him, but this is the only one I can find. If this was him, he was 14 years old. It would have been before he went in to the academy. So maybe he was out trying to find himself. Maybe he was one of the grunts on the party, and he decided, I'm going to go home and get an education. Very possible, because I don't think it was all that out of the ordinary for a 14-year-old to be out on his own, looking for adventure, looking for his place. A.J. Bell, he was local. He was with the original party. He was with Martin McLeod when they founded McLeod County. And I don't know a lot about his personal life, but his name keeps turning up. He was the local guy, the local surveyor when the group got to Glencoe, and they were joined by the local people. He's the one that brought them up the Hassan River, which is now the South Fork of the Crow River. Hassan means maple in the Sioux language. And he's the one that brought them up. But interestingly enough, there's a 2012 document that talks about the actual organics of our soil and the layout of McLeod County. And they rely heavily on Mr. Bell's research and a couple other guys that were in that original party. Because remember, they're all looking for farmland. That was the whole thing. So, and this was an amazingly rich area for farmland because it was where the big woods meets the prairie. Anybody not heard that term before? This is where the big woods meets the prairie. It's basically the natural end to the savanna forest. So if you think about it, when we go west on Highway 7, once we get to Cosmos, look around the landscape, it looks a lot like South Dakota. And when we go east and we get to St. Bonnie, look around the landscape, it looks a lot like Wisconsin. The legend is that a squirrel could climb a tree in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and never hit the ground until they hit Hutchinson. So, those are the players. And just think about how there was nothing. You're going to hear in Mr. Pendergast's own words that if they wouldn't have taken a right at Glencoe and they continued to go straight west, they would have had to go another 2,000 miles to find a non-native. Isn't that amazing? So this was truly the edge in the Northwest. Besides that, he was learning. He likes a good story. And I like how he wrote. So we'll just get started. This is read at the monthly meeting of the Executive Council would think of the Library of Congress on February 11th, 1901. Founding of the town by the Hutchinson singers. The gradual decadence of the gold excitement which drew so many thousands to California during the half-dozen years succeeding the discovery of gold there in 1848 turned to the tide of migration toward the west borders of the Mississippi. Long trains of westbound travelers headed for Chicago every morning and evening from New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Chicago was the great distribution point. There, all stopped to catch their breath, to take their bearings, and the 30-year-old city at the head of the Lake Michigan seized the business which these folks had brought during the California boom. She, Chicago, took advantage of her opportunity and also, I fear, of her innocence, tenderfoot victims. The immense tidal wave that was dividing. One branch followed southwest into bleeding Kansas, following up Massachusetts, 30,000 Morrill rifles. The war cry being freedom for Kansas. The other stream swept northwest to the region of the sky-tinted waters. So this was new to me. I didn't realize that the whole purpose of a lot of the migration, and especially for the Hutchinsons, was to go to Kansas and push back at the South, because the South was coming to the north. So they refer, to those defying rifles. Right? In the spring of 1855, I was caught up in Massachusetts and swirled along in this mighty movement of restless humanity, but not to the land of gold. Chicago, the Garden City, was to be my ultimate thrill, my firm abiding place. But the best laid schemes, though mice and men, gang aft ugly. 2 months later, I was potting my weary pilgrim way through southern Minnesota, spying out the land and weighing its future. It seemed to be beautiful land, just as it came from the hand of nature. And any farmer should have been satisfied with 160 acres of it. But I was told that 100 miles more to the northwest, on the borders of the big woods, the soil was still better, and the outlook even more alluring. That promising, if not promised, land, I then and there resolved to see before many moons had waxed and waned. The trip I was then taking could not be prolonged on account of work awaiting me in Milwaukee and Chicago. In October, I started out on my second Minnesota trip, upon which 2 weeks were spent in explorations to the north, east, and south of the Falls of St. Anthony. By that time, I was getting too late for the survey of the big woods country. If the job was to be thorough, I had to go now. Fired with zeal for the new land, I went back as far as Milwaukee, and in a few days had the pleasure of hearing my old friends, the Hutchinson family, from Milford, New Hampshire, Judson, John, and Asa, sing to a full house. I found this interesting. Lynn, Massachusetts, and Milford, New Hampshire are very close together. So to Mr. Pendergast, he thought they were from Milford, New Hampshire. Might have been where they met. Maybe he saw them perform the first time. But we all know that they have been told that with some of the things about the name of the street or whatever, and the name of the township, that they were from Lynn, Massachusetts. So he went and saw the three brothers sing to a full house. We've come from the mountains of the old granite state, and other inspiring songs rendered as only they knew how. After the concert, at my invitation, they all promised to call me the next day, which they accordingly did. In our pleasant talk, they unfolded me their plans for the future. They had started out to sing their way through to Kansas, there to found a village, call it Hutchinson, make homes for themselves, build up a town, and join the Jayhawkers, and squelch the border ruffians. Say why not skip all that blood and poetry and go to Minnesota, the most favored country on the earth, and found a city that you will always be proud of. So it was this turning of events. Pendergast was smart. You know, everybody who was running down to Kansas was headed for a fight. And he said, why don't you just skip all that blood and poetry and embrace who you are and come up here and be ready. I thought that's an interesting observation. Probably a good thing that everybody didn't have that attitude. But it might have been the right thing to do for the Hutchinsons. So they asked him, have you been there? And he said, yes. Then questions followed like shots from a Gatling gun. The answers were satisfactory and led to the settlement of the town of Hutchinson in McLeod County, Minnesota. Hither, many later immigrants have been attracted, and they are now faithfully working shoulder to shoulder with the old-timers who have borne the burden and the heat of the day to make this what it certainly bids fair to become the most charming and 71 delightful, most cozy, and truly home-like place in the Northwest. I don't know what 71 means in that context. The result of the conference was an immediate change of plans on the part of the Hutchinsons, who had in so short a time become convinced that their horoscope had not been rightly interpreted. It was agreed that my cousin, Roswell H. Pendergast, should go along with them, and that I should stay through the winter in Milwaukee to dispose of my photography business and follow on the first boat that should go through from Galena to St. Paul in the spring of 1856. So he sent his first cousin and his friends out here. The objective point was someplace in the charming region west of the Big Woods, to which allusion had already been made. The exact spot was to be fixed upon by the Hutchinsons, their advance agent, E.D. Johnson, and R.H. Pendergast, who went with them. Having arrived at the little village at the west side of the Mississippi, adjoining the Falls of St. Anthony, they were lucky enough to fall in with an educated and enterprising young civil engineer by the name of Lewis Harrington, who readily entered into the spirit of their plans and who without hesitation accepted an earnest invitation to become a member of their company. Before they left this little settlement, Colonel John H. Stevens, its father, the father of St. Anthony, B.E. Messer, an accomplished musician and former singing master, John H. Chubb, a young bachelor from Whitehall, New York, Henry Chambers, an unnaturalized Canadian, and Lucius N. Parker, and John Califf, were duly initiated into the fraternity. So they hired all these guys to do their grunt work. November 16th, 1855, the company, with 2-horse teams and a week's supplies, sailed forth like Don Quixote in quest of adventures. The general plan formulated at Milwaukee had been talked over and deliberated upon until it was made more specific by fixing upon a favorable location on the Casson River, now called the South Branch of the Crow River, northwest of Glencoe, as the most desirable place for the new settlement. There was a good road as far as to Shakopee, which was at the time larger than Minneapolis. There, the first night was spent. November 17th, without waiting for breakfast, so anxious they were all to get a glimpse of the town to which they were to be fathers, they started out bedtimes in the morning. And, crossing the ferry 5 miles farther up the Minnesota, reached 72 Carver in season for breakfast. From Carver, the road, if the straggling path made through the woods by the Glencoe settlers earlier in the season could be dignified by such a name, suddenly became much worse. Numerous stumps, deep roots, the deeper chuck holes, mud, and fallen trees opposed to their passage. Nightfall found them weary and way-worn, with the aspect of the night of the sorrowful countenance. Their horses jaded, and with a bag of game consisting of a brace of ducks, 3 partridges, a solitary rabbit, and a squirrel on the banks of a small stream 2 or 3 miles east of the present site of Young America, and 11 miles from Carver. By this stream they prepared to camp at the night. The game was soon skinned, dressed, roasted, and disposed of in a most heartily, if not most approved style. And no dinner at the West Hotel, or even at Delmonico's, was ever better enjoyed. November 18th, at daylight, the camp was astir. After a pickup breakfast, the tent was struck, and the pilgrims were moving toward their Mecca. A couple of partridges roasted before the improvised fire, with a proud or 2 of hardtack served for dinner. Buffalo Creek was crossed before sunset. Chambers going ahead and breaking the ice with his feet. As the water was 3 feet deep and Glencoe 5 miles away, he unwillingly admitted that he got little fun out of this operation. Over a smoother way, better time was now made, and twilight found our explorers on the outmost verge of civilization. They would have had to push their way 2,000 miles farther unless they changed their course before reaching another town or meeting a white man. That's how new Glencoe was. Dottie's Hotel, a 1-story log building with all the modern improvements, offered them a welcome, a shelter, and first-class accommodations at first-class rates. And there they ensconced themselves for the night. November 19th, with A.J. Bell, a Glencoe surveyor, for a guide, the line of march was resumed. As the road they had been following ended at Glencoe, the scattered groves were their only landmarks. They struck the Hassan River at the bend near the spot where Philip Moussin, the Frenchman, now lives. Here was a delightful grove, resplendent with the gorgeous hues of a Minnesota Indian summer. The air was crisp and invigorating, the scene was charming, and the party would willingly have tabernacled 73 there. The sky, the earth, the air, the overreaching trees, the shimmering stream, and fertile soil were so many circuses wooing them to stay. Where are they? They're in Biscayne. Now, for those of you who are hunters or have traveled through Biscayne, especially in the fall, and when you drive through Biscayne, when you look to the east, do you see that low expansive area? It's kind of hazy, and then there's that bluff of trees. And it's like a little plateau with the Crow running through it. And it is beautiful. And they fell in love with it. They said it was just absolutely an amazing spot. Thanks, however, to Mr. Bell, who assured them that there was a better place 6 miles farther up the river. The company, after a few deep-drawn sighs, reluctantly moved on. Some on foot, some riding in wagons, these being the first to reach the promised land. While they were pitching their tents at the edge of the grove west of the place now occupied by the Catholic parsonage, Parker went back with one of the teams to meet the rest of the party. When the last straggler was picked up and brought in, all were seated in Turkish fashion around the crackling campfire, they with one voice declared that spot the most beautiful and attractive they had ever seen. The charming woods, the winding sweep of Crystal River, the range of circling bluffs beyond, the smooth, lawn-like slope from the forest to the stream, and the autumnal rovings of shrubs and trees, creeping vines, the bewildering beauty of the whole view, all combined to awaken their enthusiasm, stir their blood, and set every nerve to tingling with delight, while hope was busy with her brush and easel, painting bright visions of the future. So, as near we can tell, that campfire took place real close to where our freshwater treatment center is. Pretty much at the intersection of Bluff Street and Highway 7 up on that hill, as they looked back over that expansive area. Another interesting point that is just touched on is that there are already Catholic missionaries here. Interesting. The Catholic Church was out ahead of the government, ahead of the game, but I'm guessing they were here to convert the Sioux, to be my guess. He doesn't expand on it at all. Messer, the poet, the artist, and optimist, the dreamer par excellence of the company, which was divided about equally between poets, artists, optimists, and dreamers on the one side, and plain, practical men on the other, seized his fiddle, which was never far from his person, and struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. The Hutchinsons and all who could sing joined in. For the first time since the morning stars sang together, grand strains of heavenly harmony echoed through the listening groves, and finally died away on the range of circling bluffs beyond the distant river. So they're here, and they think it's pretty cool. And it looks a lot like this one, only it's 1,000 times bigger. And that's what they fell in love with. So I always like to say, that was the first tradition for Hutchinson. Because to this day, many of us can't travel from Glenmore to Hutchinson without stopping for a short time and visiting. Probably for different reasons. Fascinating, though, that Mr. Bell, he really knew McLeod County. He knew it well. He had already been doing research with the types of soil and how water would flow and all of those things. And he was an invaluable. So there were many people that influenced the Hutchinsons. Mr. Pendergast being one, but also the locals. And of course, Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington was a good businessman. So it was time to adopt the Constitution. On November 20th, a business meeting was held at the tent of Colonel J.H. Stevens. And Stevens was chosen president, B.E. Messer secretary, and A.J. Bell, Lewis Harrington, Asa B. Hutchinson, B.E. Messer, and J.H. Stevens, a committee to draft a constitution and bylaws. They then adjourned to meet at Glencoe the next morning. November 21st. The company met according to adjournment, and 74 adopted articles of agreement, which were substantially as follows. There shall be 2 town sites, each containing 320 acres. Harmony to be located on the south half of Section 31, and Hutchinson on the north half of Section 31. So there was a statute. There was a statute in the legislature that the towns could only be 320 acres. And I think it was a federal statute, actually. And their concern was this, that land developers that had a lot of means could buy up land and perceive or speculate on the success of a town. So people like the Harringtons may very well make a town 1,200 acres, 1,500 acres, and then hold the deed to it. And then as the town grew, be able to cash in on it. So the downside of that is almost all of the communities that were being founded were coming in as twin cities because they could do up to 2 contiguously. They were looking at that, so they changed the statute shortly thereafter. And that's when Hutchinson and Harmony all became one. But before that happened, they hired Lewis Harrington to design the Twin Cities. So we are sitting in Hutchinson, but the State Theater was sitting in, or it would have been sitting in Harmony, because Washington Avenue was the splitting line of the Twin Cities. Okay? I'm going to pass this around. It's a very interesting thing to look at. Actually, we sell these as a fundraiser. How much are they, Pat? Like $15? $20. It's kind of fun. But you notice that the collaboration. So Harrington is the surveyor, and the Hutchinsons are the artists. So the parks and Town Square, which we are sitting in the Town Square or the Park Square, which was changed to Library Square when the library was built, which Kay is going to talk about that next month. We'll talk about this wonderful building. But you'll also see that the names of the streets were named after family members, musical terms, and things that were important to the Hutchinsons. So we have Handel Street, Mozart Street, Harmony Lane, Lynn Road, all these things that they brought with them for their interests. You can pass that on. And then just for the heck of it, you can turn over. This is the 1858 Harrington Roundhouse. It's the earliest drawing. This is the prop from one of our tours. So anyway, they adopted the following. Number 1, there shall be 2 town sites. We talked about that. Number 2, the 2 town sites shall be divided into 100 shares. The Hutchinsons shall each have 10 shares. Each of the 11 men with them shall have 5 shares. The remaining 15 shares shall be disposed of by the Hutchinsons as they think best. Remember, they weren't very good business people. The river shall continue to be called its Indian name, Hassan, maple leaf. L. Harrington, R.H. Pendergast, and Henry Chambers were appointed to do the business of the company and dispose of the lots to actual settlers. Special meetings shall be held at any time on the written request of 3 shareholders. Any shareholder neglecting to pay authorized assessments shall forfeit his stock. It was voted to employ L. Harrington to survey the 2 sites, and his compensation would be $380 for that done. 5 acres were set apart for the Humanities Church. 15 acres were set aside for a park, and that afterward was increased to 22 acres. 8 lots were reserved for educational purposes. It was solemnly decreed that in the future of Hutchinson, remember it's November 1855, in the future of Hutchinson, women shall enjoy equal rights with men. That was unheard of. When did women get the right to vote? 1920. 1920. Just think about this, 1855. Yeah. They were really outside the box. They were amazing in how they felt that they were abolitionists. They were really into justice. No lot shall ever be occupied by any building used as a saloon, bowling alley, or billiard room on the penalty of forfeiture of the lot. Well, some things out of necessity just have to change. The next morning, the company set out on their return to Minneapolis. During the winter, Messrs. Harrington and Bell surveyed the town site. Harrington really doing all the business connected with the survey, though he and Bell took the contract together. So Harrington gets a lot of credit for all of these things, but it was really Bell that was a great resource for him. As long as they were working together, I think that it's pretty obvious to me that it was a really important partnership. And Bell was also probably somewhat of a man of means. Surveyors were hired by the government, so they had regular income. And he actually was co-owner of the Wirt Academy, the very first school, which was downtown, that burnt down, which doubled as a town. Agreeable to my promise made the fall before I left Milwaukee, 75, on the 11th of April, 1856 for Hutchinson. My father and brother, a cousin, now at Saxena, T.V. Chesley, and 6 others had come out from New Hampshire to go with me. We reached Reed's Landing at the foot of Lake Pepin on the 14th. There we waited 2 days for the ice to break up. When tired of hope deferred, we walked around the lake 30 miles over a muddy road to Wacota, where we found the time and tide with one of Lewis Roberts' boats with steam up ready to take us to St. Paul. This steaming up we found was only a trick to make us buy tickets at once. It was played several times before the boat finally left. We landed at St. Paul on the 17th and took passage on the Reveal for Carver. And on the morning of the 18th, we all left on foot for Young America, where we stayed that night, sleeping 4 in a bed, wedged in like smelts. The next day, hard walking began to tell on the older members of the party, and the 3 young Pendergasts, Chesley, Atherton, and Glass, soon left the others out of sight. At Glencoe, they got a lunch and pushed on, following directions received by some men who thought they knew the way. At nightfall, we camped by a lake 6 miles out and a mile or so east of the present Hutchinson and Glencoe Road. We had no blankets, no tent, no food, except a few pieces of hardtack bought at Carver the day before. Solomon, however, shot a goose near the shore of the lake. But as bad luck would have it, she flew out in the middle of the lake before fall. Here was a pretty kettle of fish. I prepared half a dozen little sticks and tried to get the others to draw in order to decide which one of us should swim out and get her. It was 40 rods to where she lay. The ground was beginning to freeze around the edge of the lake, and little needles of ice were shooting out from the shore over the still water. There was nothing alluring to be seen except the goose floating on the bosom of the lake and what seemed a long distance away. It was not a tempting bait under the circumstances. No one would draw a stick. Disgusted with what seemed to be their cowardice, I went around to the opposite side of the lake as the goose looked nearer that shore and plunged into the ice-cold water. On reaching the goose, I looked around to take my bearings. The camp looked as near as the shore I had left. So taking the goose's neck in my mouth, I paddled towards the fire which had been kindled under a big oak and looked very comfortable, but which at the time did me very little good. The water was lighted up more than it was warmed by the blaze. Nearly benumbed, I landed with the trophy, only to find my thick woolen stockings had been burned in my absence by one of the boys who, through kindness, had undertaken to dry them for me on the fire. In 3 hours, the goose was dressed and roasted. A half hour later, every bone was picked, as clean as the mounted skeleton. This done, we lay down on the bare ground with some sticks and brush above, and the stars twinkling through the impromptu lattice work. There and thus we slept and slept of innocence abroad. At noon of the 20th, we surprised Roswell and 4 companions named Gray, Whitney, Failing, and Cook, from whom Lake Hook got its name, who were holding possession of the J.E. Chesley hut, which stood a few rods from the southeast corner of the town site. Mr. Chesley, finding provisions running low, had gone to St. Paul to replenish his stock. That evening, the rest of our company arrived, and taking us all together, it must be admitted that as famine rears, we were a decided success. The visible supply of food, which consisted of about 20 pounds of flour, totally disappeared in 2 days. A bushel of potatoes, which had been procured for seed, lasted but a little longer. A 2-bushel sack of horse feed that stood in one corner of the room was not quite so quickly disposed of. It was ground coarse. The hulls were rough and plowed furrows broad and deep from one end of the esophagus to the other. We made much of this and sweetened it with Hassan River water. After each meal, we devoutly thanked the Lord for ground-fed feed, and we felt grateful that it was well with us, as it was. After a few days, Mr. Chesley came back with scant supplies for so many, and then he and I started back to St. Paul immediately on foot. Bought 4 yoke of oxen, a wagon, and a load of goods, including a big breaking plow. After 2 weeks of hard struggling over stumps, through mere holes and mud lakes, we crossed the Hassan once more, plowed the first field, and harvested the first crop ever raised in the entire Hassan Valley. The grasshoppers, however, which came in countless swarms about the 1st of July, left little for us to harvest. Amazing, that first 6 months, that first trip. When you think about it, there was just nothing. And you know, having been involved with Historic Hutch for 25 years, continuing to tell all those wonderful stories, sometimes we forget just how rugged these people had to be, how rugged these men had to be, and how rugged their women had to be, which we talk about next year, when it comes time to talk about setting up the town, the first town meeting, which didn't happen until 1858. Okay. Steamboat navigation on the river, something I didn't think was ever possible, but it was. The scarcity of food, mail carriers, and of course the 1862 Sioux Indian uprising. So I hope you don't think that was a cop-out, but I think he told the story much better than I could have with the research, and because he lived it and he knew the people, and to his credit, to see the potential in the geological location of this area was really something. So any questions? Is there any questions about Historic Hutchinson or any things that I may have found in my resource. I can't give you a list of books again. Where the Big Woods Meets the Prairie by Brian Haynes is really a good book. It's an easy read. It's done in chapters based on little events of the area. Again, Julie Jensen's book, the Hutchinson, the story of Hutchinson, is a really good book. And there are just, right now, looking at a lot of different books that talk about Little Crow, and that is a fascinating story as well. But we're really glad that you could come. I mean, we just think this is an amazing turnout. And we want to remind you that one of the things that we've done, the decision that Historic Hutchinson made a little over a year ago, that we were going to discontinue using our tours as fundraisers and start giving them away. How many of you have ever been on a Historic Hutchinson tour? Okay, so about a fourth. The next one is Wednesday, the 19th at 6:30 p.m. We leave from the depot at 6:30 p.m. and we'll return about 8:45. Okay, it's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. It's a fun tour. We have a good time. We look at the inside of some of these buildings, and we talk about some of the other interesting characters, in addition to talking about some of the architecture in the town and how it grew. And we would really encourage you to take it. It's free. All you have to do is email historichutchinson.org at gmail.com, historichutchinson@gmail.com, and you can also find all that information using Facebook, Historic Hutchinson. And then if you follow us on Facebook, you'll get some reminders. We would really encourage you. One of the reasons that we decided to quit using it as a fundraiser is we want to more so use it as an education tool. And it's where we kind of pick up our new members. We don't sell memberships, we just show up at meetings and get to work. And we are a busy group, an amazingly busy group. I don't know how many times in the last 25 years we planned our funeral for the organization. But all of a sudden, about 10 years ago, something amazing happened. And all these young people started showing up. And we have flourished. So Historic Hutchinson does a lot of things, like host music in the park and take on projects for people. And when the barn is finished, we'll start looking at the interior of the Harrington Merrill House and getting that done. So the Harrington Merrill House is a National Historic Site. It's been on the National Register since 2012. The very first building in McLeod County to go on the National Register of Historic Places is this building, the Carnegie Library. There's also a residence in town that's on the National Register, the Merton S. Goodnow House. So Hutchinson has an amazing story, an amazing, amazing history. And the best thing for Historic Hutchinson to do is to tell that story so that is reflected. But we think WW's statement was really spot on when he said that the last straggler was picked up and brought in, and all were seated in Turkish fashion around the crackling campfire. They, with one voice, declared that spot the most beautiful and attractive they had ever seen. Wow. That's kind of a mouthful for a bunch of folks that came all the way from the East Coast. So, we're really glad that you joined us today, and we're always happy to answer any questions. If you have a church group or a fraternal organization, anything going on, and you would like your own Historic Hutchinson tour, all you have to do is reach out to us. Drop us an email and we'll figure it out. We're pretty good at figuring that stuff out. All right. Awesome.
Thank you.